Hello guys, Sky here, and Airbus continues to please us with new toys. On July 19, on the runway of Blagnac Airport in Toulouse, for the first time took off the new cargo plane Airbus Beluga XL. And so, here we have the mixture of a serious airliner, industrial logistics, and original design with a tiny pinch of cuteness. In our today's trip, we'll try to figure out what this thing is and what was it built for. And the history of this particular breed of aircraft begins at a time when not just the Beluga, Airbus itself didn't even exist. These are the 1960s, and we are not talking about airplanes, but rather about rockets. The newly formed US space agency NASA is putting all of its efforts into accelerating the development of the national space industry and catching up to its main competitor, the USSR that is rushing ahead. The agency consolidates all major US producers, builds infrastructure, and creates new rockets. The first big result of this work is the Mercury Redstone 3 program, which on May 5, 1961, sent the first American astronaut Alan Shepard into space. It looked pretty cool, but obviously not enough. Firstly, Yuri Gagarin by this time already collected the laurels of the first cosmonaut, and secondly, Shepard's flight was suborbital and lasted only 15 minutes. The reason for this was of course the rocket. NASA realized that for further advancement into space, they're gonna need something a lot more powerful. In 1961, the Saturn I carrier rocket was developed, the firstborn of the Saturn family, the latest model of which by the end of the decade launched several guys to that little nearby rock. The rockets of the Saturn family were a breakthrough and incredibly powerful carriers for that time, and even today. But there were difficulties with them, one of which concerns our today's topic. The first is that most of the launch sites of NASA and the US Air Force are in the state of Florida, and most production sites are located at the other shore of the US. Small and medium-sized rockets can be transported by trucks and railroads. But here's a question the Saturns asked of the engineers. How are you going to transport that? The first stages of the rockets were so large and heavy that there was no choice, only by the sea. It was logical but still painful. A huge structure was loaded onto a special barge and driven to the Cape Canaveral by the sea, where the rockets were eventually being assembled and launched. It was very difficult and expensive. Besides, there was a risk of damaging the rocket on one of those steps. It was planned to transport the other stages the same way, but then some smart guys came to help. A big feature of this kind of cargo was in a curious combination of a huge size and small mass. Basically, these stages were just giant empty tanks with engines. Noting this feature, a group of experienced aviators came to the conclusion that the upper stage can be transported by air. It's cheaper, safer, and most importantly, much faster. In the 1960s, they founded the Aero Space Lines Company, which was supposed to operate planes for the NASA cargo transportation. But the problem remained. No aircraft could carry such cargo. Engineers cheated. They took one decommissioned Boeing 377 Stratocruiser. Good thing it was the dawn of the jet age, and piston aircraft were actively dumped into the secondary market. The plane retained most of the design and systems, but the fuselage was fairly redesigned, increasing its size to a maximum diameter of 6 meters to accommodate large loads and giving it such a strange look. Another feature was the loading scheme. Large structures were loaded into the aircraft by splitting the fuselage. It sounds a little crazy, but the plane was actually put on the cargo. This miracle was created in 1962 and named Pregnant Guppy. Operation was very successful and NASA loved this plane. But the times didn't stop. The rockets have evolved and became more powerful and large. Saturn I was replaced by Saturn 1B, and then the giant Saturn V. The Apollo program was in its peak, and the need for transportation grew. It was necessary to use not just more aircraft, they had to be even bigger and more effective. Aerospace lines, responding to such requirements, decided to update their fleet. Now they took as bases several former military Boeing C-97 Stratofreighters. Technically a deeply modernized Stratocruiser, equipped this time with turboprop engines. The rest of the work resembled that which they did last time, but the new planes received even bigger fuselages. The maximum width of the cargo compartments shifted to 7.6 meters. Now it could take on board cargo weighing about 24 tons, and thanks to the airtight crew cabin, it flew higher and faster. The cargo compartment remained unpressurized, as everyone thought that the disassembled rocket parts do not need to breathe. The maximum takeoff weight increased to 77 tons, almost 14 tons more than its predecessor. Aerospace Lines assembled 5 planes and called them Super Guppy. The aircraft were quite actively used by NASA to transport parts of rockets, space vehicles, and other expensive toys. Now we can ask a question: why such planes were not used in the Soviet Union? They've developed many rockets, and one of them at that time was pretty big. The answer once again lies in logistics. The fact is that despite the use of Guppies, the first stages of Saturns were transported by sea. As you may know, it is difficult to deliver the rockets by the sea to the Baikonur Cosmodrome because there is no sea. The upper stages were also very large and could hardly fit in any aircraft, although some ideas did arise. As a result, the stages of the giant N1 Moon rockets were assembled directly here, from the elements and systems brought from other factories. Parts of other carrier rockets were much more modest in size and quite manageable by railroad, for some time. We will return to this later. In the 1970s, after the end of the Apollo program, the demand for big-boned aircraft fell significantly. Aerospace Lines at that time had already been sold by its owners to another company, and the gang of flying fish was mostly pressing the concrete of airfields. As the replacement of the Apollo came the Space Shuttle program, and the production of this complex was very different from its predecessor. The boosters were not so huge and were delivered on the ground. The main fuel tank was too big, and it was transported by sea. The shuttle itself was also too large, so a special transport was created for it. On the basis of 2 Boeing 747-100 aircraft, the shuttle carrier aircraft modifications were created. NASA cleared the lower deck, leaving the upper one for the personnel, strengthened the structure of the aircraft, and installed the supports for placing the shuttle on the top. The main distinguishing feature of the 747 SCA is the modification of the tail with the installation of 2 additional stabilizers. The fact is that the main vertical stabilizer, located exactly behind the shuttle, turned out to be less effective. The additions were needed to restore stability of the carrier. A similar adventure happened to the main NASA competitors on the other side of the ocean. The Energia Buran program became the mother of the most complex and advanced space transport in the USSR, and indeed in the world. And its production logistics were somewhat similar to the American, but only to a degree. Despite the external similarity, these carriers do not have much in common. Since the sea near Baikonur did not appear, and the giant Energia and Buran could not be transported by the railroad, the time has come to turn to the Soviet aviators. They did not develop Guppy. It was decided to create modifications to the already existing large aircraft. To transport large sections of the rocket, the Missishev 3M strategic bomber was modified. The engineers stripped the aircraft of its military systems, strengthened the fuselage, installed supports to position the cargo on the fairing over the fuselage, and also modified the tail, replacing the central stabilizer with the 2 large ones at the end of the horizontal tail. The logic is the same as in the case of Boeing. Political systems may have been different, but physics is the same everywhere. 3 VMT Atlant aircraft managed the transportation quite successfully, but this was a temporary solution. For more efficient transportation in the future, engineers decided to create an increased modification of the An-124 Ruslan heavy military transport. The modification here turned out to be very wide. The fuselage was extended, the central wing box was redesigned, the landing gear was enlarged, and under the wing 6 engines at once were installed. The tail of the plane followed the example of its predecessors. Instead of the central stabilizer, 2 on each side. Thus, in 1988, the world's heaviest transport aircraft was born. The only one of its kind, An-225 Mriya. The irony was that Mriya was in fact too late. The preparation of the first Buran launch was carried out without it, and after the first launch the program was stopped. The Buran was carried by the An-225 several times, but not in the operational order. Although the uniqueness has its results, the An-225 continues flights, pleasing spotters around the world. Well, now we can leave space and return to our sea creatures. In the early 1970s, the merger of several European aviation companies led to the birth of the Airbus industry, and soon their first airliner, the A300, made its maiden flight. Strange as it sounds, the A300 has similarities with Saturn rockets, in terms of production of course. As I said, the final assembly of giant rockets was carried out in Florida before the launch, and the factories themselves were scattered around the country. The final assembly of the A300 was carried out in Toulouse, and the plants that produced the parts were also scattered around Europe. Here the politics also played a role. The largest participants of the cooperation were France, Great Britain and Germany. And of course each country wanted to play a big part in the cooperation. The French had the final assembly, but the Germans and the British kept to themselves the manufacturing of sufficiently large aircraft elements. The A300 is a large plane, so not all of its sections and wings could be effectively carried over land. The sea and rivers had their place in logistics, but they did not cover all the needs. Then the Europeans remembered the good old Super Guppy. These aircraft were quite actively used in the transportation of Airbus airliner elements in the 1970s and 80s. The Super Guppies performed well. The transportation time was minimal, the turboprop power plant made the aircraft quite economical, and the suppliers and assembly lines saved a lot of money on large warehouses. The parts arrived clearly when needed and in time. Beautiful. Although there was a small reason for gloating, because these transports were made on the basis of Boeing aircraft. The guys from Seattle laughed that the Airbus airliners are being created on the wings of Boeing. However, by the end of the 1980s, the planes could not meet the requirements of the time. The intensity of operation grew, the cooperation expanded. Besides, after taking a break from large liners and creating a family of narrow-body A320, Airbus once again went into the attack on the niche of roomy planes. Soon, Airbus planned to create the new flagships, A330 and A340, which meant that they needed something more efficient. Many options were considered. In the beginning, of course, a logical question arose. What about heavy transport aircraft? C-5 Galaxy, C-17 Globemaster III, An-124, and of course An-225. But that was never really an option. The cargo was special, as I said in the beginning, large dimensions and low mass. All military transports were created with the opposite goal, to carry relatively small but heavy loads. First of all, military equipment. The elements necessary for Airbus simply would not fit in such aircraft. The installation on the top also did not fit. When it comes to the periodic transportation of shuttles, sure. But constant and intensive transportation with loading and unloading this way would be a logistical nightmare. They've decided to take the concept of Super Guppy and scale it to meet new requirements and technologies. Engineers took the A300-600R airliner as the basis of the future transport. Created in 1991 for this program, the Super Airbus Transport International Company, or SATIC, received funding from the parent corporation and started the modification. So the A300-600ST Super Transporter was born. Like the Guppy, most of the design and power plant received minimal changes, but the upper part of the fuselage received a diameter of about 7 meters and a length of 37.7 meters. And yes, the tail was subjected to changes already standard for such an aircraft. The main stabilizer was kept, but decently increased in size, and the horizontal tails were given additional tips. Another change was the loading and unloading system. It was necessary to accelerate this process as much as possible. Here, the design of Guppy was not effective. Too many onboard systems of the modern jetliner were in the nose, so each time this nose would be removed, these systems would need to be disconnected and connected back. Raising the cockpit, as the Boeing 747, was not possible. It would require a considerable strengthening of the structure, so it was decided to do the contrary, to lower the cabin. The plane became even more exotic, but the operators received an easily raised nose fairing, and behind it a huge cargo cabin with a long, flat floor. This cabin, however, like with the Guppy, remained unpressurized. Again, it had to carry aircraft elements, not passengers, and pressurizing would only complicate the development. The payload mass reached 47 tons. By the standards of the modern transport aircraft, the figure is rather modest, but for its own purposes it is quite sufficient. The appearance of the aircraft, especially after painting it in white color, quickly made it clear what name it needed. That way appeared the name Airbus Beluga. In total, 5 aircraft were born, which began active operations since 1994. The main task of this team was transportation between Toulouse, Hamburg and several other Airbus sites in Europe. However, over time, the uniqueness of this transport was appreciated by other organizations that were sometimes taking Beluga for rent. By the end of the 1990s, planes became so popular that there were ideas of expanding parks, selling to logistic and military operators, or even creating larger versions based on a flagship, the A340. But these plans were not realized. The expenses turned out to be more than final profit. And now there may be one more question. If these planes were so effective and Airbus was so happy with them, why was Boeing ignoring this idea for so long? At first glance, Boeing should also have used such aircraft a long time ago, but no. They created their own large transport 747 LCF Dreamlifter only in 2006. What changed? Production logistics, of course. It's all about the logistics. At first, the company made narrow-body aircraft, and their parts were transported on the ground, and they're doing so until now. When the company entered the age of wide-body airliners, Guppies were not needed, because first of all, good luck loading a fuselage or a wing of the 747s inside this plane, and secondly, their extreme patriotism. Unlike Airbus, most of the Boeing production sites were in one country, in the US. And unlike NASA, their aircraft production sites were not just in the same country, but around the same city, Seattle. Boeing 747 and its followers in fact were completely created in Everett, near the place where William Boeing once made his first airplanes. This is one of the reasons why the plant there is so huge. Almost everything was done under its roof. But times change. The cooperation went beyond the US and jumped the ocean. At the beginning of the 21st century, the role of foreign manufacturers grew, and the apogee of this trend was the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. During the production of this aircraft, contractors began to provide large elements of the structure, and then it became necessary to transport them. For this, Boeing created huge Dreamlifter transports. In the same way, in many respects, thanks to this aircraft, the company was able to distribute production even more. Along with the Everett plant, the 787s began to be assembled at a new plant in Charleston, South Carolina, on the other side of the country. And here we are in the 21st century, time of a new generation of flagships. In Europe, the A330 is no longer the newest liner, and the A340 has retired. The giant A380s are leaving the runways of factories, and another leader is entering the game, the newest A350. Like this is not enough, the production has become even more intense, and there are more factories, some of them on other continents. Airbus Beluga cannot operate in these conditions. If in 2014 they flew about 4,000 hours, in 2017 this figure has doubled. The aircraft fly 5 times a day, 6 days a week, and even this is not enough. The situation of the late 1980s is repeating, and its solution is repeating. In 2015, Airbus officially announced the Beluga XL program, the goal of which will be to create a new, more capacious and efficient transport that will carry first of all the elements of the A350. The new aircraft should replace the old Beluga by 2021. As the basis, this time the engineers took the Airbus A330 airliner, more precisely several A330 planes. The tail section from the Model 300, the nose from the Model 200, and the cargo compartment floor from the freighter 200F. The new plane is 6 meters longer than its predecessor, its fuselage is 1 meter wider, and the payload weight has grown by 6 tons. Most of the solutions are inherited from the predecessor. The tail with 3 stabilizers, a lowered nose, landing systems, all this proved to be excellent and came directly to the new model. Assembly began in 2016, and in the summer of 2018 we already saw it in all its beauty. On July 19, the aircraft made its maiden flight. While Airbus executives were arguing how many Mini Coopers would fit in, the plane gracefully flew around Toulouse and landed. This time the guys from Airbus confirmed the name and right away gave it a smiling face. By 2019, the operations of the Beluga XL will officially start. According to the plan, 5 planes will be delivered to replace the 5 old Belugas, which however will not retire, but most likely will be periodically used by both Airbus and other operators. I will note that the already ancient Super Guppy sometimes still flies, performing transportation in the interests of NASA. And on this positive news, I will finish today. Like and subscribe. Fast flights and soft landings to you.